part one, which is essentially done, though there might be some additional material that I'll add. The focus is largely on the problem. Part two, I don't like the word, but theoretically, the focus is the solution. We've been working somewhat downstream from here, and one of the keys that we've been talking about is building up a phenomenology. And simply by way of recounting, the difference between a phenomenology and other ways of looking at the world is that its focus is to be a description. As such, in theory, there are no assumptions. It's kind of, as we've said before, a mythico-poetic. Which takes us in part to the question of the origin of language, if in fact there is such a conversation to be had. But in addition to that, it raises the question of what is the starting point. To some extent, we've been talking about that, and the assumption that we've made along the way is that we're assuming that the model used by Heidegger is the way forward. So one of the questions we want to ask today is there another way? If so, what would that look like? And if not another way, how do we begin to create the logical bridge? Because we don't want part two to appear to be totally disconnected from part one. Does that make sense? Okay. So, if we think about potential phenomenologies, we're talking about largely a 20th century phenomenon. So there's only so far that we can go back from a purely structural perspective. With that in mind, it basically limits us in the latter part of the 20th century. We have Merleau-Ponty and Paul Ricoeur. More explicitly, Merleau-Ponty, less Paul Ricoeur. But, for example, if we look at some of his works like Sign and Symbol, Fallible Man, they seem to presuppose some form of phenomenology. And since both are technically post-Heidegger, post-Husserl, there is a sense in which neither one is new under the sun. They are both in some shape or form in debt. Are we clear so far? Okay. If a phenomenology tends to describe not explain, and there is a fundamental difference, where does it start? What does it seek to describe? Are there any assumptions that are brought to bear? And finally, is there a sense in which there is experience before language? When I think about this, I think particularly in terms of the kind of conversation that we see in The Ascent of Man. If you remember from philosophy, Bronowski talks about walking into El Castillo and seeing the human handprints on the wall. And the question he asks is, how did this happen? What does this mean? And the answer is, I, a human, did this. So the implication seems to be that part of what distinguishes potentially humans from other life forms is this fundamental awareness. One of the questions we want to look at as we move forward is this what we mean by consciousness? Is this the origin of consciousness? In some shape or form, we also want to deal with the fact that in a very primordial way, we need to know what the origin of consciousness means. Is it synonymous with awareness of self? Is it synonymous with being aware in Freudian terms of the fundamental separation? If we were to walk back to El Castillo and if we were able to watch, what would that tell us about the nature of the relationship between humans and the world, if anything? So, in part, there is a certain speculation here. We can't be 100% sure about what that looks like. But we know that at some point in human evolution, humans separated themselves or became separate from other species. And awareness of the world, awareness of self, and awareness of others appear to be the three major components that drive that. And the world. Mm-hmm. So if we think about each one of these, there's a sense in which awareness of self begins with the awareness of others. Because in recognizing that you are not me, I am recognizing you as other. And yet, not simply other, in some shape or form similar to me. When I recognize the world, we're again brought back to that fundamental relationship of and that also seems to characterize, in one respect, my relationship to you. In a very organic way, we are very similar. But I am not you, nor are you me. So it would seem that from the beginning, if we describe the relationship of the I to the world and to others, there is a fundamental experience which would imply that in one of the things that experiences that we've been talking about, that separation characterizes even the fundamental need for intimacy. Am I making sense? What are you thinking? Okay. So if we come back in a sense to Heidegger for a moment, nowhere is that apart from more obvious, more painfully present than in the confrontation with mortality. It also serves to highlight how deeply tenuous our relationship to the world and to others is. When we recognize the tenuousness of that relationship, can we say that potentially this is the origin of what Heidegger calls angst? Potentially also the origin of time. Is there a relationship between time and the tenuousness of existence? I think the answer is yes. I can situate myself between what has happened and what has yet to happen. Whether I label that time or not, the fluidity of human experience in an uncertain world would seem to be the origin of time. Again, as we move forward, we'll look more closely at some of these concepts. And we'll see, ultimately, how they work out. To go back, I want to stress the fact that this is simply not philosophical. That I intend to draw on anthropology as much as possible, and obviously the mythico-poetic. And whatever other academic disciplines or sociology or whatever we happen to deem appropriate. I remember a few years ago reading an article that caught me quite by surprise. And the argument was that even before our species existed, one of the proto-species of our kind, the Neanderthal, were already ceremoniously burying their dead. How far back that goes, I don't know. We probably have to stop short of saying that all humanoid species for all time were aware of death. But at least by the time of the Neanderthal, if not before, mortality is an important part of the human experience. Make sense? We don't ceremoniously bury our dead if it's not. So, does it become a question of what do we as humans truly know? If we could strip away logic and reason, what would the world look like? What would we actually experience? Would we in some way become childlike? How far back can we go? We've talked about Plato before, and I want to come back to him. The point that we've made every time we've talked about Plato is that when he comes to the limits of reason, he always resorts to myth and to metaphor. We've argued that this is an example of the dichotomy of language that we pick up in Wittgenstein. Can we subsequently make the case that the language of logic is secondary to the language of poetry and myth, a later development, a further derivative? And I suppose that what is making me profoundly uncomfortable right now is that when we step back this far, it comes down to, or we are subject to the critique that this is simply conjecture. We weren't there. I'm hoping that some of the answers to that will be found in anthropology. As inexact as that information might be, and given the fact that anthropology itself is going through a bit of a metamorphosis, I would still like to think that we can glean some information from there. I also want to pursue the question can we speak about a primordial emotional experience? If so, and I think in some respects we have to, what would that experience be like? How do we in fact describe it? So if we think about that primordial experience in terms of where we are, potentially we're talking about tens of thousands of years. To get back to that, do we have to strip away all the layers of human culture? Or is that primordial experience in some way always still there? Perhaps we can talk about it as being veiled by modern society or clothed in logic and reason. Heidegger talks about the being question being forgotten. I think I'm more or less saying the same thing. That experience is still a part of us. We've just forgotten that it's there. So let me stop there for a second. I'm more in fact-finding mode than typical. I'm trying to get back to a fundamental starting point because I think that what's missing at the moment is the connection between parts 1 and 2. And if we go back to my friend Steve's comments, I don't want this to be a revision of Heidegger. Clearly, I am in debt to Heidegger, and much of the methodology we're using is clearly Heideggerian. But I'm trying to both get further back than he went, and I sense a kind of incompleteness in what he left us with. All right, making sense? Am I coherent at all? Okay. So let's go back to Plato for a second again. You may remember from philosophy that Plato started out to write 3 dialogues. He wrote the sophist, he wrote the statesman, he never wrote the philosopher. And I think that ultimately he didn't write it because he realized that the statesman ultimately needed to be a philosopher. But the point of the myth of the unwinding of the universe is that the philosopher can hear the music of the cosmos, which has been lost through the chaos of the gods and humans. The point that Plato makes is that the responsibility of the philosopher through the use of just laws, is to build a just human and humane society. And if we start there, what does that tell us about, what can that tell us about how the universe can be perceived? And potentially how we can build a phenomenology. We want to keep in mind also that in the past we've talked about two parallel traditions in Western culture. What does a phenomenology that uses components of all of these traditions ultimately look like? Where do we start and how do we build it? So to go back to what we said a few minutes ago, the experience of mortality is key. Whether we talk about mortality in a life negative sense or a life affirmative sense, going back to our conversations about Erich Fromm, we find in the experience of mortality, on the one hand, our common bond to other humans, a common bond to the world, but in the realization that I am going to die. And that could happen at any moment. I am separate. It also raises the question of, what does death mean? Why does it happen? How is it that I can be and not be? In terms of Heidegger, we've talked about the link between this and his question, why is there something? Rather than nothing. So if I can make the case, and I'm hoping I can, then everything that we know to be human can be found in the moment when we become aware enough that we know we're going to die. So this encounter, I'm going to argue, is the origin of consciousness. When I take my death as my own, when I realize that I am going to die, I am conscious. It's not enough to be aware of the world. It's not enough to be aware of others. I become truly conscious when I step into the dichotomy, or the paradox if we prefer, of a part of and apart from. So the argument will be the awareness of this in-between-ness, as we talked about it last time, is the beginning of consciousness. We may also want to regroup around the question of time. If I know that I'm going to die, and I mean know here in the experiential sense, not in the cognitive or rational sense, then it seems to me that I can further heighten the experience of in-betweenness. I am after I was born. And I am not yet at my death. Time becomes the measure of the in-betweenness. I am not there at either end of that spectrum, but I am always in the transition from the one to the other. And perhaps when we come back to Heidegger's concept of the taking of the measure, what I'm really measuring is in-betweenness. My uncertainty, my constantly repositioning myself between where I came from and ultimately to where I am going. Questions, comments, thoughts? I have a sense that I'm not as logically concise as I typically am. Am I being concise enough to follow? Okay. So if this is correct, if this argument can be made, then time is inseparable from consciousness. And again, we're not talking about linear, we're talking about the mythico-poetic concept of the way that time unfolds. I also want to find out in the longer term, or explore the possibility. If you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about one of the fundamental characteristics of mythico-poetic time is that in some strange way, the future, the present, and the past are all layered or wrapped one on top of the other, around the other. That in some way the past is always here and not here. The future is opening and unfolding, but the future is not opening and unfolding. I remember a conversation as a child. I asked someone what time it was, and the response I got back, he was a bit of a smart ass, was, I don't know why you're not seeing my screen, but I'll log in again, sorry. His comment was that I can't tell you what time it is. I can only tell you what time it was. Let me check my IP address here. And there's a sense in which he's right. I can't tell you what time it is. By the time I speak the words, the time was. So if this is true, then there is no true separation. If anything, the present is even more fleeting, imprecise. Remember the concept we had about Whitehead. The moment is always in the process of coming into being and dissipating as soon as it is. If we look at time that way, then the present and the past and the future can never be separated. In fact, when we move to a logical linear time, we are separating them. But when we return to the ground, to the foundation, to what we're calling the primal experience, then they are here all the time. Every memory, every emotion, here, now. So, to truly be in the world is to live in a world in which the past, the present, and the future are somehow always together in the moment. In more precise terms, however many weeks we have been in this room, all of those moments of us in this room together are here now. And memory becomes the bridge between future and past. As we said a couple of weeks ago, this is why Heidegger was so focused on Heraclitus, because in the world of Heraclides, everything is in flux all the time. Thoughts, comments, questions? This seems to be a particularly perplexing leap. Okay. Okay. So we can reframe Heidegger in a sense, and we can argue that to be, let's clear that out and do it again. And that, as we argued last week, this sense of in-between-ness because if we look at our conversation about time, the present is neither past nor future. The past is neither present nor future. The future is neither past nor present. But insofar as I remember, call to mind, reassemble, then I am tying them all together. So it's as though there is a kind of paradox together yet in between. Together yet neither. If we skip ahead briefly to Erich Fromm, we could perhaps argue that when Fromm talks about the three basic types of human society, the differences comes down to how they handle the in-between-ness, the neither-ness, the togetherness. So in terms of how we describe a life-negative culture, the dominant emotion becomes fear, dread, distrust. In a life affirmative culture, trust, intimacy, safety. So the character of a society is not logically functioned. I'm sorry, let's try that again. It's not logically defined. It begins with an emotional response. As we've said before, every emotion has a logic. The logic of the society becomes the logic of the emotions that underlie it. The confluence of insecurity and distrust and fear, anxiety, serves to stress the neither-ness, the separation. And the logic of that becomes destructive. And the logical end of that is racism and sexism and violence and aggression. The logic of an emotion that stresses the opposite becomes a benevolent, caring society. By far very different. Comments, thoughts? Is this helping to begin to flush out where we might go? Mm-hmm. How we anchor all this down, how we begin to refine this and talk about this, I'm not yet sure. I'm far more brainstorming than I typically am. At least it feels that way in my own head. But I am definitely looking for a ground, a foundation, a starting point. I don't want this to be dismissed as simply a revisionist Heideggerian phenomenology, because I don't think it is. I think the methodology is clearly Heideggerian, but I think there's much more than that here. And I will trust you to tell me if you feel otherwise.
We thought about starting with language and then moving with consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And I am struggling with the concept of language right now.
Because then from consciousness you go with.
Mm-hmm. The answer to this question is yes, but will we ever definitively know? No, we won't. We can't point to a point in human evolution. 40 years ago, if you read an article about Neanderthal, they would tell you that there was no way that Neanderthal could speak. Recent anthropological evidence suggests that's clearly wrong. But it also assumes that all language is in some way spoken, and we know that that's not true. You can touch someone's hand and speak more profoundly than any words could ever. So, in some way, we need to come to terms with this as well. Correct. And right now, I'm not sure. I think for the next couple of weeks, we're just going to have to continue to work, try to put some kind of a structure in place, look for a foundation point, and take whatever risk once we have that point that we need to take. Comments, questions, thoughts? I know it's almost time to shut down and go to class. Been helpful? Okay, I'm going to continue, hopefully, to go back over that document. I may make some revisions in terms of what we've talked about this morning. And I'll try to get you something before we meet again.